I guess I want to start by asking what your earliest memory of improvising is and how the role of improvisation in your practice and approach to the voice has evolved since your earlier days of singing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I even would have a conscious memory of it. The context was that I grew up in a spiritual tradition. I mean, primarily Hindu, but it was actually kind of pantheist. I mean, Hinduism is a pantheistic religion, so but in this particular sect, we like incorporated all religions. It was kind of universalist, but within that, there's a devotional singing tradition called bhajan, and I feel like people know a little bit about it now because Alice Coltrane had an ashram of this same kind of denomination, and they released a bunch of her like bhajan recordings on vinyl on David Byrne's label a few years ago. So I feel like it's like something that may be familiar to some people through that. But that's what I grew up singing. It's a call and response tradition, and accompanied by harmonium, which is why I play harmonium, and um, and sometimes tabla and different Indian drums and things like that. And in that, because it's call and response, usually the soloist is like a lot more improvisatory. Although I started singing these songs when I was like 3. So I was like already by 5 like would sometimes be handed the mic to do the lead, and you're supposed to improvise, like, but I wouldn't have ever thought of it as anything. Like, I wouldn't have conceived of it at that time as that. And then, from singing in that tradition, especially the singers in our um, in our like community who were really really skilled improvisers, those just like would imitate like what they do and just kind of like absorb a certain kind of language. Like, I never studied um, Indian classical music, so this is a devotional song form. It's like more a folk tradition. But then I also grew up like, you know, performing Indian dance, classical dance. So I was also listening to Carnatic improvisers all the time. But it was kind of going in more through osmosis. And the dance is not at all improvised. It's very, very prescribed. But the rhythms that you do in your feet are the same that the drummers do and that they improvise with. So it was kind of just around all the time in that way. But then I guess paradoxically, like, my main other musical activities were choir, um, from elementary school all the way, really all the way through college. There's no improvising there. I mean, like, all my other musical activities were so very much in the Western tradition. I wrote, I played guitar, like, was my first instrument, like, when I was 15, but I mainly played rhythm guitar, and it was more to write songs. Um, and the way I would fall into a song and like figure out a song was through improvising. Was always through singing, like, was always like first through my voice. Like, I wouldn't like conceive of something and then, that's still true. But then kind of when I started doing it more in earnest, I guess, in college is when I really started to, I was always into jazz, like, since I was young, but in college is where I got very into like the late Coltrane period and Ornette and Cecil. I would say Cecil Taylor was the first thing I ever saw that was purely, truly free improvised. I mean, maybe I heard the Ornette collective improvisation, but I had not. I had not really like witnessed somebody fully free improvising, and it was just so attractive to me. But I lived in LA, and there wasn't really a community around that. And I was in a post rock band, like a 10-piece post rock band, and we like had lots of like big extended sections where we were like improvising, and I always realized like that was the thing I kind of was most excited about. So when I moved to New York, um, I think my first class, I went to Brooklyn College for grad school. And the very first class I had in the very first week, the professor Salim Washington, who's an amazing scholar and tenor saxophonist who's now teaching in South Africa, um, assigned George Lewis's A Power Stronger Than Itself. I was already familiar with Braxton and Roscoe Mitchell, and I was like very, into their music, but I didn't really know the full kind of story of how it started and the philosophy. Um, and I think that's where, because, politics and political music had always been, I was always gravitating towards that. Like the first songs I ever wrote were Iraq War protest songs, like when I was, 16. Um, and the political underpinnings of the AACM and the idea that like improvisation was about freedom and was revolutionary. And I was still doing a classical voice degree, my master's at Brooklyn College. So I was like doing classical music and new music and like doing a ton of like heavily notated music, and at the same time reading about these improvisers who were also composers, who were also doing interdisciplinary work, who were like, it was just so open and so free. And I was like, I need to shift something about my practice. So even though I had always kind of been improvising and been around it, and like it was culturally very familiar to me because of music school, it had just been pounded out. Like I just hadn't really thought of myself as an improviser for so many years. And then New York is just a place that's so, it's like a great easy way to connect to the community. Um, and the improvised music scene, the at that time, this is like 2009, so like the DIY, like kind of experimental and rock and noise scene, and like the new music scene, like they were all very like enmeshed. Like there were groups like Z's who were reading like full notated scores like in like basement clubs in Williamsburg. There were like, just like you could go to the Stone any night of the week and see insane things. And I kind of started meeting people by like improvising. So like I think the first like true free improv session I had was with Max Jaffe, who ended up being the drummer of Elder Ones. And then each time I did it, I noticed like, especially as a vocalist, which I hadn't seen as many examples of. And I really was not trying to approach it like from the idiom of free improv, because like anything, it has a language now that is sort of rooted in a history, and it's been somewhat codified. But the voice has a little less baggage maybe in that sense, because there's just not quite as many. It's like not like being a free improvising saxophonist, let's say. Um, and so yeah, I really like, I had to develop a vocabulary every time I would play with a different person, just like their individual um, language would kind of force me to like, rethink my own each instrument, like improvise. Max is a drummer, like improvising with a drummer was so, at first it felt so strange, but now I have a duo with Matt Evans, who's a drummer and a percussionist, and it's like it feels somehow also so natural at the like voice and drums. But I had to really like develop some interesting new vocabularies to be able to like kind of hang in that situation without just like screaming and shouting over the drums. And and through improvising, I regained a sense of like thinking of myself as a creative person. um, and I realized, especially through like the political kind of imperatives of the AACM, realized like, how much of my conditioning was really this Western kind of white supremacist conditioning. And improvisation almost became a way to like decolonize my voice and my practice, and like the hierarchy of a composer. Like I wasn't thinking of myself as like a creative person with agency anymore, because I had just been so, composer says this, do this. Yes, it's not even possible, but just figure it out, like some rhythm that makes absolutely zero sense. I'm like, can you sing this back to me? Can you tap this back to me? Oh, no, I'm the composer. You just do it. So it's just like, it was freeing in every sense. It was like, it felt like less hierarchical. It felt, yeah, just like less in that sort of prescribed Western tradition. Although, as I continued and as I kind of became a pedagogue, I realized how much improvisation had also been part of the Western tradition. It's just, uh, you know, all kinds of publishing and all kinds of things, and colonization kind of fueled its like codification. So like I'm I feel like even as a classical musician, I had been like robbed of like the true history of the music by not getting to. I did a little figured bass stuff because we had an early music program in my college, but it yeah, it was never like, it was always like a fringe practice.
Can we go back and talk about your background as a dancer in your early years? Do you think that that has in any way influenced your musical improvisation? I mean, that foundation and movement and gesture. Do you think that translates at all to your musical language?
Uh, the dance. So I kind of learned, it's Bharatanatyam. It's a South Indian classical dance form. It was very much against my will. Um, and it was very much because the Carnatic teacher lived on the other side of San Jose and the dance teacher lived closer to us. And it drove me nuts because I knew I was a singer always from day one. So I was like, like what? Well, you have to do something, and she's close. So, um, and so at the time I was just like, I had such a separation in my head of like, this is not music, this is dance, like has nothing to do with what I'm interested in. And it just got kind of pushed into like a trauma corridor. Like I just like put it away and didn't really think about it. um as I started improvising and as I started like composing, I realized, whoa, it's so in there. It's like insanely in there. And I wouldn't say movement. Like Indian dance, yes, there's gesture and there's expression and you're moving, but the foundations of it are rhythm. You're a percussionist, truly. Like there's the dramatic sections are more like storyteller, kind of like it's like theatrical. And actually, that's another area in which like it really, really had an impact on my performance. I remember in like my senior recital, like for voice, for classical voice, like all the Bharatanatyam stuff started coming back, like in terms of like the expressivity. I was like, I'm singing in German, like how do I get this across? And it was very like I kind of went to the theater expression for a lot of that. So I realized like, wow, that really had a huge impact on how I express on stage as a performer. But then the rhythms, like truly what the drummer, what the mridangam player is doing, you're doing with your feet. So like they would use like palm or like different joints, and things like that are kind of different moves. And for a dancer, it's like the flat of your foot, your toes, or your heel. It's the same. It's like the same thing. My dance teacher did konakol, which is like the I guess in dance maybe it's called solkotu, but it's like speaking. You like are speaking all the rhythms. Um, and yeah, when I look at my music, it's like I never studied Carnatic music, but like so much of what I do is like additive and subtractive patterns and really like extremely asymmetrical cycles. Like I just wrote this piece for Dither, and they were like, "What is this in?" And I was like, 11, I guess. Like it's like they're all like that. I don't know why. And I think that's so much from that dance practice. I really didn't realize it, but I think it's partly because it was learned through embodiment. Like it was learned through my body, through my feet. And so it didn't get kind of intellectualized in my head. It really is just like in my body and it just comes out in that way. And when I improvise, I definitely like I realized, a lot of my peers who are diaspora folks who studied Carnatic music, so much of their improvisation is like the gamaka, the microtonal kind of like oscillations and ornamentation is like really melodically driven. And I realized like so much of like that doesn't come out as much in my voice because I didn't train in that way. But like rhythmic like way of improvising is so much part of my like approach, I noticed.
I'm wondering, like, when you were talking about developing, uh, not necessarily like performance practice for voice, but in a way, I guess you could call it performance practice for free improvisation. Because as you said, wasn't a long history of that before you started. Like, how were you doing that consciously, or was it through just collaborating with different people and absorbing different sounds and responding to them, or were you like on a mission to develop that, or maybe it was both?
Oh, I think it's like
Did I
a
cut
little
out?
freezy. I heard everything. It was just kind of like
Okay,
a little slow. Hopefully, it's cool. Let me know on your end
I
how
can
it
hear
is.
you now. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Uh, in turn, well, I should say it wasn't. It's not also that necessarily that there isn't a vocal history. It's like it's the one everyone's least aware of, including myself. So, I did eventually check out like Jeannie Lee and Waters and June Tyson and like a bunch of and Abby Lincoln and folks. But it wasn't like they weren't like the free improv records that everyone was checking out. My mission to was self exploration. Like that's why I was improvising. It was because at least initially, like I knew I didn't feel good in the classical scene. Um, I didn't identify in like I mean I had been singing notated music forever, but I just noticed like socially and sort of like how institutional it was. I was like really gravitating towards like on more like DIY, like set up your own show, like at the Silent Barn. Like there was so many things that weren't really gelling, and so improvisation. I was just like, I need to shift something, and I it because it was just like opening me up in so many ways. My primary concern was like finding myself, finding my voice. And then the other thing was because I had been so like fixed on Western traditions, like part of finding myself was a bit about going to my roots. And so I did start taking Carnatic lessons like more in earnest. I guess like starting in like 2011 or so, um, which I've been studying on and off for the last 10 years with no intention of like being a Carnatic singer or anything, but just to explore those roots. Like that's like our indigenous music, in many ways, although there's a lot of other uh, truly indigenous forms in India that are kind of erased because of classical music. That's a whole other Carnatic music. That's a whole other issue. But so it was really like this self discovery thing, and then I got to have these like interactions with these just insane folks like in 2013 Muhal Richard Abrams, who was the founder of the ACM, called me on the phone and left me a voicemail to be in his piece at Roulette. And I was like, oh my God, like this is literally why I'm improvising. Like this person and this group. And it was a bunch of AACM folks. It was like Amina Claudian Myers was in that group, Warren Smith was in that group, and JD Perrin and Tom Buckner. I think that's how I got the call. Was I was working with Robert Ashley, and so I who's another insane person who actually is an improviser, and improvisation is a huge part of the practice of his music that nobody talks about. And that experience, like just working with those people and really being exposed to like this is a tradition. Like it's truly it's an emergent tradition, but it's very much a tradition. And these are the masters of it. And so through situations like that, like I learned like I wasn't trying to be idiomatically free improv, but I was trying to understand the approach from the tradition of people who have been doing it for so long. like last night, for example, I went to Union Pool and just a venue in Williamsburg and saw um, Shahzad Ismaili, Darius Jones, and Ryan Sawyer trio. These are people I've been seeing since I moved to New York. I think Darius Jones is probably one of the reasons I first moved to New York, because his band Little Women melted my brain. Like, it was my favorite band. And I see I participate in a lot of free improvisation still. I see a lot of free improv. And this set reminded me of why I even gravitated towards free improvisation in the first place. They were playing at such a truly high level. Like, I really hope someone recorded this set, because it was some of the best improvising I've seen in years. I think, like, I'm trying to think of what another set that did quite like shook me in this way. But because you can go anywhere, like they went to places where you couldn't possibly get there by like conceptualizing. You just couldn't. One person couldn't sit down and be like, well, we're going to have the modular synth come in with this like really arpeggiated oscillating thing, and then the saxophone is going to do this thing, and then the drummer is going to start singing and he's going to do that. No, you just wouldn't arrive there like that. And it was so inspiring, but it was like there's such a rigor to get there. Like, that trio has played together free multiple times. Like, that's something I'm trying to remember, is like that we do a lot of ad hoc stuff in New York, and I like that. It's like either you have a band where you write music and there's improvising in it, but it's like tunes and you have that, or you do a bunch of ad hoc free improv. But I'm like, oh man, I should have like a regular group that I play free with, because there's a whole other, it's like, Barry Guy, Paul Litton, Evan Parker, like you play free together for 50 years or something. And the discipline, like, I tried to approach it in a bunch of different ways. I tried to approach it like from a personal standpoint. Like, Carnatic music was like one avenue. I was like going back to the bhajan singing tradition, which is why I like went back and got the harmonium out, and that became like the instrument that I started writing on for Elder Ones. I was, like looking at Braxton's language music, and I would kind of like do timed free improvising like by myself, choosing a couple parameters of the language music, like, like the various like there's things about register or like articulation, or all kinds of different things, and try to set like some parameters, because yeah, it is hard, but like solo improvising is still something I'm like very, I know I've had improvisers tell me like that is like really where you like build your practice. Like, you have to have a solo practice. It's tricky for voice, but at least in my practice, I try to do that. And then I have like Yusuf Latif's like repository of scales and melodic patterns. So sometimes I'll just like, pick a page and try to adapt it as a vocal exercise, and just like really put a lot of inputs, just like a bunch of input, and um, allow that to kind of manifest in improvised situations more unconsciously. So, some of the practice is just like the normal technical practice that any instrumentalist would do. So just like upkeep of the instrument, like try to do a lot of different things with it, and then see what happens when you play. But I love talking to other improvisers about their approach, because everybody, it's so distinct, it's so different. Like for me, I know that singing a bunch of George Crumb had an impact on my improvising. I don't exactly know like the one-to-one relationship, but it's very like, I was listening back to this free recording I did, and I was just like, oh, there's all the Crumb, like there's all his like phrases, like they're all just there. So you just absorb. So like it was cool. I think being a collaborative performer also has a big impact on the improvising, like singing inside someone else's music. So like, for example, Mary Halverson is a crazy improviser, and then being in her band, um I have to like be inside of Mary's music. So I improvise in that. I mean, there's composed areas, and then like I will have to solo over Mary's changes. Like that's totally different than anything I would do myself. I have to first of all understand what they even are because they're so insane. And then, but that has built a whole other muscle for me. Like I never really sang harmonically in that way. And then that music, like as a collaborator, really had me go to a new place. Or Darius Jones's vocal group, which was called the Elizabeth Caroline Unit, it's like all wordless. It was like all wordless abstract. It was kind of like a language that he developed because the story was like we were four aliens and we were like all four giving birth to this child, and it's like very Afrofuturist. There's like a comic book graphic novel with it, and so the syllables we were singing were this language, and they were like very related to like they were kind of based around solfege, but he called it like solfege, and uh, and I also like through my vocal training as a classical musician, my teachers were teaching me a lot about like vowel modification and like different registers. You kind of like go to, you edge towards different vowels, and like that plus the Darius stuff started like becoming a language for me to articulate that wasn't like scat or jazz based. It was like kind of personal and individual, and so like the first Elder Ones record had no text, and it was almost like the easiest way for me to get into composing because it wasn't bogged down by having to write a song, like the pressure of like being a vocalist and having to write a song. It was just like had this other language. So the collaborations really have a huge impact on how how my craft, I guess, as an improviser developed. So it's like conversations, collaborations, putzing around by yourself in a practice room for a long time. Uh, yeah, it's a little abstract, but and then now I've been like studying. I'm like messing around on alto saxophone for the last 2 years, and that has also been another window to me because it is so much more tactile. It's like I can see what is happening. I can think in a different way. So that has like also had a little bit of translation to how I sing and how I improvise as a vocalist. I can kind of do on the saxophone in a way that's like not so saxy, I guess.
I would love to hear your saxophone playing.
Well, I mean, there's one. I did a show at Roulette in October 2020, which was probably very premature, but with Maria Grand, because we had a duo where we both sing and both play. So she's like an amateur vocalist, I'm an amateur saxophonist, and we wrote these duo pieces. It was at Roulette, so it's online. You can watch it if you really want to. It was really fun. It was like, in a way, it was like I don't want to do this with anyone but Maria because she was my teacher. So it was like kind of like, it felt like safe for me.
Well, I wanted to ask you about your instruments. I mean, you play the harmonium, and I'm curious about how um, uh, free you can get on that instrument. And I know that you've also been incorporating some like synthesizers and electronics, and I'm just curious about your improvisational practice on these various instruments and how they, like the saxophone, maybe they inform your vocal improvisations and language as well.
Yeah, I mean, harmonium. It's weird because we play it in bhajan music. It's like it's actually has a really interesting colonial history because it was brought to India by missionaries to convert Hindus, primarily Hindus, also Muslims, and actually, it's very much a part of like some of the Muslim singing traditions, devotional traditions as well, in Pakistan and all over the place. But it was basically brought as a portable organ to convert folks and teach them hymns. And it was, with a foot pedal, like we've seen the European harmonium. That's the predecessor. That came first. And then that's why it has a Western keyboard. And so it was adapted by, you know, folks in India for their own devotional music. They cut the legs off, they put it on the ground, and they adapted it. So I grew up singing with it in that context, and they do improvise a lot on it. They like basically the harmonium mirrors the melody, and it's like repeating the melody, and it's doing a lot of the same ornamentation that the vocalist is doing. And often the vocalist is the person playing harmonium. That is very typical also. But then like the harmonium player in our community would like, yeah, it's just like once the person starts singing, he like immediately figures out where, you know, what tonality they're in, and like the song, and like just really quickly like figures it out, and then kind of goes. It's like maybe like playing church organ or something. I never really did that deeply, and I kind of feel like my approach to the harmonium was really weird. Like I do improvise a little bit on the harmonium, and like the first, especially the first Elder Ones record, which is like all harmonium. There's no synth on that. And I would say I probably improvise in a pretty like idiomatic way, but mostly the harmonium is uh, like a bass doubling. Like I feel like I used it in a way that it doesn't is pretty detached from its like original usage. I like don't play chords on it, which is actually something that happens in budgeons. It was sort of like a little bit of taking the Western harmony from like hymns and stuff, and like harmonizing like the devotional music. I barely ever play a chord. I guess the new set like has a couple chords in it, but I kind of used it as this weird bass doubling. And actually, the first two Elder Ones like sets have like everybody's almost playing the same thing. Like it's really monophonic. It's like the harmonium is playing the bass line, the bass is playing the bass line, and the bass line is also sometimes the melody as well. So the saxophone might also be doing that. And what I liked about that was it would create this kind of like frequency spectrum. It felt like one instrument, but then you know it was very like heterophonous. So even though we were playing the same thing, like not playing it the same way, but it would have, you know, the sax is like the soprano sax is like really at the top of that frequency spectrum. Then you have like the harmonium, which would either be droning or doubling the bass line, and then you have the bass, and it would sort of be like this one sound somehow. I really liked the sound of the doubling of the harmonium and the bass. And then now I definitely use it in different ways, but I don't improvise so much on the harmonium for whatever reason. And the synth, it's very loud, clicky. Amplified harmonium, it's like, it just, if I start shredding on it, you just hear nothing but clicks. I don't know. Maybe I would improvise more if I figure out like a better, maybe like piezo mics, or I don't know, something for it. But it's creaky and wooden, and yeah. But synth, like I improvise a little bit more on, and I'm trying to explore. Like Sun Ra is definitely my like inspiration there, of just, you know, and Alice Coltrane. I like using that pitch bend a lot. And my knowledge of synthesis is like pretty basic, but I know enough to know what I'm trying to do. And I like, especially when Max was playing sensory percussion, so there was like other electronic elements, we would kind of like go into some zones together, and I would not just like do pitched improvising, but like really use the resonators, and like, you know, and like oscillators, and do other types of things. But yeah, like now in the band, everyone has a bit of an electronic element. So the bass player has pedals now, and the saxophonist also has like, he runs his stuff through this Moog pedal, and then I have a different synthesizer now. I have a vocal processing, like a pedal that Jeff Snyder created, which is like specifically for it was like a prototype that he was like, hey, try this and let me know what you think of it. And I really liked it. And it's a pretty weird vocal effects box. Like it has like a Harry Parch patch where like it's like, you know, sympathetic strings. Like you can actually like tune the strings differently and like sing, and then it's like all the sympathetic resonance of it. It's like pretty wild little thing. So we're kind of, I'm trying to, I still love the acoustic, like the things that happen when we're all acoustic. So I'm trying to like split the balance of like not always like going like super heavy in every composition, every part into like dense electronic zones, but find a way to bring it in and out in a way that's natural. But part of that happened just naturally because they, like my players in their own music, have like electronics as a part of their music. It wasn't like let's add electronics to Elder Ones. It was like Max started to have a sensory like element incorporated into his playing and his solo playing. Matt Nelson plays in this band Grid, but also has solo stuff where it's like very, very pedal heavy. And so it's like, yeah, bring what you do into this. And that sort of made me think like, oh, well, harmonium is like probably not going to be great in this situation, so I'll just add more gear to schlep around.
Can you talk a little bit more about the compositional approach to writing for Elder Ones and like how much of the process involves improvisation on your own prior to like a first rehearsal or first, you know, a first go at a new tune or whatever, and how much of it is like the members of the group contributing through improvisation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying not even to use the word writing because I don't even think that is what I'm doing. It's usually the last thing that happens out of pure necessity for rehearsal, and I'm even questioning if that is necessary, if I do need to write it down or not. But it's just so not how I like work out the music. So generally, I'm improvising. I improvise my way into it. Have like a billion voice memos, or I'll like make a little multi-track recording and just sing it over and over and over again and play it over and over and over again until it sort of has until the idea kind of feels sharp to me. Then I'll have all these like kind of more honed ideas. They're a little bit randomly there. Often something. Now I'm writing lyrics, and like, I mean, even when I wasn't writing lyrics, everything was still kind of about something. Like the tune for Eric Garner on the first record was, for Eric Garner, who was killed by the NYPD. And so something also like maybe I would be improvising with some idea, and it would start to get more like hardened, and then I would be thinking about something, or have just watched something or just read something, and then I would sort of like think about how does this thing resonate, does this little unit of an idea resonate with the things that I'm thinking about and processing, in a more like thematic way, I guess. And then from that process, there would be editing, where it would be like, all right, these units kind of feel like they could hang out together. If I shift the mode a little bit for this one, it actually can kind of go really well with this. And then they would kind of like become like these little groups of unit. It's almost like with this band, for some reason, I have a very, maybe, I don't know if this is becoming a bit of a crutch, but I have a form that is really typical and how I put music together, where it's like maybe like 3 units, and we like improvise our way between them, and it's our like the tunes are like between 10 and 15 minutes long. For some reason, the 3 units, that's how long it takes to get through them, and that's how and I'm trying to think about that a lot more, like in this third Elder Ones record. But although I'm also like, maybe that's just like I don't know, maybe that's just what I do. It's fine. There's a lot of other like music that has like typical forms, right? Like, so like Carnatic music has like very typical forms, like, you know, jazz has heads and choruses, and you know, so it's like I have my own forms that have become a thing, but I want, you know, I want to challenge that a little bit. And then once I've sort of like really figured out the music, sometimes I'm notating it just to see what it is, like uh and sometimes that is a kind of useful, like in the case of like rhythmic stuff. I I'll write it down. I'll be like, "That's what's happening." Like, what? Okay. Why did I write this? Or write like, why did this come out of my head? Um, but I also think sometimes when I do that final thing of making the charts before I bring it to rehearsal, sometimes the music gets much more confusing. Like, I actually, part of me feels like we'll have a, like, I remember in 2020 I had a residency at Pioneer Works, so we did some of these tunes for the first time, and it was with the new bassist because Nick Dunstan had moved to Europe at that point. Pandemic shifted, like Max moved to LA, so we have new membership now. And Eva, who's like very much like, she's amazing jazz player, but she is very much like rock musician. She was like, "Can you just play it for me?" Like, you know, because it looked ridiculous on paper. Like, there's like a vamp that is like, you know, 17, 11, like, you know, just all these bizarre like metric modulations that honestly, like, just it's just a pattern. Like, you could just learn it by ear and it would make so much more sense. But I guess I just was like, we have to have charts because that's like how things are, you know. And just like it feels like, oh, nobody has time. But like I just made this piece for Dither where I made an audio score, and I was like, you know, gave it to them with what I was like, okay, how much time would people need to like listen to this and like absorb it? So like I planned ahead, I made the audio score, but then I think just the sort of, I don't know, the typical way that it works in new music ensembles, like they didn't really have time, so then like James transcribed it, and I was like, okay, like that's fine, but I'm trying to figure out how to shift more to this oral method because I also think something is can really be gained from that, because it's like, I don't know, the visual thing is such a, like Cecil Taylor, he said, um, notation blocks the total absorption in the act of playing, and I always think of that because unit structures, like he taught the units, like he would teach the band units, and then they would, it was very much an oral method, or like, you know, like a lot of, you know, many of Meredith Monk's pieces worked that way. And I think like the kind of embodiment that comes just from like doing something fully orally, like I feel like we're losing some things in our ears a little bit, like, um, by if we have to like see it on the page, because I know some Carnatic musicians, like, you know, like my teacher sometimes will sing like a very, very long line and be like, okay, now you. And I'm like, oh my God, like, you know, but that's so much a part of the practice. And they could do that with really complex information, like lengthy, complex information. So I think it's just training a different muscle. But back to your question, I guess, when we rehearse, it is kind of like these little units. It's like each piece has like a few ideas, and truly I'm only composing to play. Like, I kind of like, I am a composer, I'm trying to own that, I'm trying not to be so weird about it, but or like insecure about it. I have very much imposter syndrome about being a composer, but I also am like, I'm a performer, like I'm just giving us some ideas to jump off of, that's it. It's like I'm trying not to have so much ego about it, because it's like we're really going to make it when we start to play it. And honestly, like this last set of music only really started to make sense to me when we went on tour recently. I was like, oh, there it is. It's clicking like that. Now it's a thing because we just played it every night. And it's like that it is a lot, the band, you know, I love when somebody will be like, well, what if instead of doing this twice, we did it once and we use this part as a cue for the next section or whatever. Like we like that discussion is kind of always happening. Like everybody is sort of and it's a very like Bob Ashley used to say this in rehearsals where you would do something, you'd be like, is this like what you mean, or like is this what you want? And he would just say like, I'll know it when I hear it. And that's kind of how I feel as a composer. I'm like, I don't know, like just do things and then I'll see like, yeah, that's cool, like do that again, you know. um or don't. Like I'm also like, you know, I really don't, I try not to, unless it's like really like something in the arranging that would really have an effect on the overall like um you know, okay, now we have cello and bass, so it's like there's some moments where if the if they're both bowing, like the cello really gets lost or something, then maybe I'll specify like actually you're going to do more Pitts rhythmic stuff here. So but other than that, like I really try to let everybody find their way into the music how it makes sense to them, and then if we really if it really needs more direction, then I'll jump in. But I feel like like, I mean, I'm working with musicians who are composers themselves, you know, and are performers and improvisers. So like I really trust their instincts, and I really don't think I would have come to any of the conclusions I did in the first Elder Ones record had I not done that with that group of musicians. Like they had so much impact on who I became as a composer, you know. So I credit them absolutely. And it is, even that band is more hierarchical than I would like. Like I would like to start to try to move towards like more collective composing, and more oral. Like I want to have a vocal ensemble that's like a little bit more like all of us are creating together. Um, and vocalists, I think, would be particularly suited to the oral kind of way of doing things. So yeah, it's very much the band is playing a part in the composing.
What are you working on now?
Well, I we just kind of like finished the next like set of music for Elder One, so we'll record that. Unfortunately, we can't record it till the fall because everyone is so busy. Um, and then I have a record coming out with Luke Stewart, the bass player of Irreversible Entanglements, and he's also just does a bunch of things on his own for kind of bass and his like feedback system and like pedals and voice, and I'm using that effects pedal in that. That will come out later this spring, and then this duo with Matt Evans. It was really interesting because he's kind of like definitely more from the new music world, um, and I feel like where we overlap is more like maybe in a rock idiom, which like I definitely grew up playing and thinking about a lot of rock music, but also like yeah, we both do have kind of the new music like common approach, but the project kind of came out of we both lost people very very close to us in 2019. And for me it was my best friend, for him it was his partner, and we weren't really friends, but I had like we knew each other, and I had just reached out to him after his partner passed and was like, if you ever want to talk about like just anything, let me know, because it was such a hard process. And our friendship kind of developed over the last few years of like processing loss. And then we like improvised together in, I guess was this 2021 or maybe it was 2020, in this session where we had just had so many of these conversations, and then we like improvise. He never really free improvises. Like that's not really part of his practice. And I'd never listened to something like right after I do it, and he had sent it to me like the next week. He's like, "Oh my god, it's really good! Like, listen to it." And then I was like I just kind of was like, "I'll listen to it later," and then I sort of forgot to go back to it. And then we looked at it again earlier this year, and I was like, "Oh my god, this is so different! It's so different than any other kind of improv thing I've done." And it's like him with drums and like this really cool feedback stuff that was sort of accidentally happening that now he's trying to figure out like how he was doing it. And it's just a different language because I guess it does not lean at all into sort of the free jazz, free improvised sounds. It's really kind of it has a very like sort of rock like zones. And so we're gonna put that record out later this year, and I have like a project with William Parker that he put together this band to um, do stuff around the poetry of this poet from Vermont named David Budbill. And then Darius Jones and I have a duo called Angels and Demons that's like based on the poetry of Sun Ra. And so we have like I think we're doing a residency in Vancouver where we haven't actually committed to making a record because like this duo is almost like it's more philosophical for us. Like we're like, should we make a record or not? Maybe this doesn't. I don't know. So we might record that or we might not. And yeah, like a lot of duos. I feel like for some reason, maybe it was the pandemic where like it felt scary to get too many people together. So I have like a bunch of duos that came out of the pandemic, which I like. And yeah, I guess like now I'm also trying to just like because I had developed all these duos of like playing really regularly with the same people, I'm kind of trying to figure out just new folks that I want to play with. So like tonight I'm playing with the guitarist Rafiq Bhatia, who's in the band Sunlux, and Qasim Naqvi from Dawn of Midi, who's a drummer who also plays modular synth. And we're doing like a trio for the first time, and I'm like, yeah, that's like I just want to play with new people again because that was for 2 years. It wasn't like, hey, let's do a session. Let's do like that's how we operate in New York. And for 2 years, that wasn't really happening. So I'm trying to like get back to, and there's a bunch of new people here that moved here, oddly enough, during the pandemic that I'm just starting to like meet and get to know. And they're a bunch of awesome people. So I want to kind of get to know them through playing. And yeah.
I guess along with that last question, who and what are your current influences?
I mean, it's, I guess, a lot of my peers at the moment. Actually, Rafiq's music is pretty high up there for me. I think it's amazing. Like Sarah Serpa, been listening to her music a lot. Like Chris Davis is another person who I just find like astonishing. Like the trio with Gerald Cleaver and Ambrose. I guess I just like in my listening generally. I listen to quite a lot of early music still. Like it's such a zone that I love to go to, especially like the kind of gnarlier polyphony of Michaud and like just the wildness of the harmony. It's maybe also because I'm thinking about vocal ensemble again. Been like listening to a lot of that, a lot of like classic kind of Arabic orchestral music. Like Kulthum is like a singer I can't get enough of, and also like classic Bollywood. I didn't really grow up listening to Bollywood, but the especially like in the 60s and 70s, there's this like really fried kind of blown out sound in those records with like just an insane number of instruments and a bunch of synthesizers, like really crazy. Like they were using synthesizers in insane ways in those soundtracks. And yeah, I don't know, but I guess a bunch of stuff. Uh like I'm finally gonna go see this movie that everybody's been like raving about. I think Everything Everywhere All at Once. That Rafiq's band did the soundtrack for, and like Nick Dunstan, the bass player from Elder Ones, also contributed stuff. And I'm really like excited to hear what a film soundtrack on that scale is of my peers. And like I've been writing for film. I guess that's another project that I'm working on. Is I did 3 um, film score collaborations with this Indian American filmmaker named Sunil Sansgiri, who does experimental documentaries. And he's going to be starting a feature soon, so I'll start working on that. So I'm like kind of thinking more about like listening to film score. Like this piece I wrote for Dither, like very much has a bunch of Morricone kind of vibes in it. I realized. But then actually when I was like researching to write that music or create that music, I was very like, I have to research guitar quartet music. So then I was like watching all these guitar quartets and like watching also dither like pieces that had been composed. I found that really daunting. That whole I had never done something with someone else's ensemble. That's like totally a first for me. Because I don't think of myself as a composer in that way. I think of myself as like I compose music in order to perform the music with other people. That's it. Um, and I was like trying to write this like new music guitar piece, and it just coming up 0, like nothing was happening, and I was like stressing out. And I was like, wait a second, electric guitar, I've been literally listening to this instrument my entire life. It's probably the thing I'm most familiar with than anything. And I was like, let me just go back to that music. So I went back to like the Pixies and Bad Brains and Minor Threat and like a bunch of Riot Girl records, and just going back to Nirvana and being like, these are perfect songs. These are fucking perfect songs, you know? And I was like, okay, hold on. I know how to do this. And just like had a totally different approach that had nothing to do with whatever new music guitar is, or I mean, you know, it doesn't have to be any one thing. So it was interesting because I haven't been listening to rock music much lately, but then in that process I like went back to so much of that music, and I was like, God, there's such a place for this in my life, especially right now when I feel angsty. I feel really angsty, like in a way that's different than when I was a teenager, but it's very anxious, and like it really is cathartic. Like I went to see it's a very silly concept, but it's so fun. Greg Fox, who's an amazing drummer, improviser, Angel Deradurian, and Mick Barr, another insane like New York improviser. They have this band called Black Sabbath Cover Band Rehearsal, and I had never seen it, and they played at St. Vitus recently, and I was just like losing my mind. Just Black Sabbath songs and some Ozzy, mostly Sabbath. And I was like, oh my God, like it feels so good to just headbang your way through an evening. And I realized like, man, this music had such an they're like the Elder Ones piece, Eat the Rich, is basically the Sabbath riff. Like it's like I think maybe also was actually a Schoenberg like pitch set, but it also is a Sabbath riff. Like I don't know. They're the same basically.
There's definitely several heavy metal moments in that song.
Yeah. Like it's just there. Like I just I grew up with a lot of punk and metal, and like a lot of socially conscious hip hop, which I think like informed the political side. Like that was like the most like kind of explicitly political music, and punk was really political too. So it's kind of been cool. Like when I go running, I like never listen to anything but hip hop. So like um that is like an area in which I will like Armin Hammer, that record Haram that came out recently, was like, has really been in my head. Or listening, going back to a lot of, after MF Doom died, I was like going back to a ton of MF Doom, and I don't know, there's just, it was like, I do listen to a lot of my peers. That has become like so much of the bulk of my listening lately, and I'm like trying to go back to some of the roots of like what got me into music in the first place.
Kyle, do you have anything else? I do have one more question, but I know we're low on time, so
Go for it.
unless you had something. Okay. I was just wondering if, now that you've composed for Dither, and you said that was like the first time that you were commissioned to compose for another group. I mean, did you enjoy that process? Like, is that something you plan to keep doing? And yeah, I'm just curious to learn more about that.
It's really interesting because I really didn't enjoy my process when I was by myself. Like, in fact, it brought up so much traumatic stuff that I felt a bit crippled, and I was like really struggling. I had such intense imposter syndrome. I think that imposter syndrome is very related to race and gender, like, of just having not, for so many years, not identified as a composer in that way, and then kind of going back into like what was a new music setting, which is something that I like specifically kind of turned away from, and just having so many sort of ideas that they're not going to take this seriously, they're not going to take me seriously, this is dumb, like everything. It really was like kind of horrible. Like, I was really having a bad time. And then I was like, I'm going to sing in this. And then that sort of like helped me a little bit. And then I was like, could we have drums? And they were like, Brian Chase is already on the concert, so Brian Chase could play drums. I was like, okay, cool. And when I came in rehearsal, I was like super like apologetic. I was like, I don't know. I don't even know what this is. Like, I hope this makes sense. Like, I don't know. I was just really insanely self-effacing, like super insecure. I know these guys. I've known these guys for years. And then we started playing it, and then I started to like feel good. Then I was like, oh, wait, this all makes sense. This is cool. Whoa, like this sounds really good. And like, there's a lot of room for them to, it's very much like in the same kind of format as like an Elder Ones piece or something, like in terms of like it's composed, but there's like areas for people to improvise, and like I'm asking people to try things, and there's like a free section, and um it was like fun. We were all having fun, and they were like very like, this piece is great, like it's so fun, like I don't know, it's so insane what that psychology, and I felt it in different scenarios. Like, I taught classical music history at Manus, which is like something I'm really qualified to teach, but for some reason, literally having never had a professor that looked like me, it just like, I was so insane in how I prepared for that class, and like I did like 70 hours a week on that, and just like research and trying to like be as good as possible. Like the amount of compensation for that kind of insecurity is kind of, it's psychologically like intense. It's something like I literally was working on with my therapist like while I was writing the piece, because it was so bringing up so much stuff for me. So it's like not something I necessarily want to dive into right away. It was really intense for me. And like Yarnwire has asked me to do things like experiments in opera. Like, I actually said no to a few commissions because I was like, I'm not a composer in that way. And and I also felt like, I don't know, I cannot really imagine writing something that I wouldn't be also performing in. But there are other composers like that. Like, um, there's very few pieces of Meredith Monk's that she isn't involved with. Like, Bob never wrote anything that he wasn't involved in. There is like a model for that. It's not illegitimate, but still, like, it's like I have to like justify it, like, oh, there's a tradition, there's a history, like I'm just part of this other thing. I don't know. um it's something I'm working through, and I think it was good for me to do because it made me like process a lot of that stuff. And then the piece itself is like about that. The piece became about this like processing, kind of like this racialized imposter syndrome. There's this bell hooks book called Killing Rage that's kind of like about the micro and macro aggressions of being a woman of color, particularly being a black woman, but just being a woman of color, like where, yeah, you have to overcompensate constantly. You have to like look at the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings. Like that was just such a perfect example. Like look at how qualified this person is, and the kind of ridiculous like line of questioning. And so the piece became like, I was like, these four white guys of dither very much represent the the guys who didn't let me into their bands when I was in high school. Like I played guitar, I wanted to be in bands. No one wanted to be in a band with a girl. Nobody. Like it just wasn't like, it wasn't a thing. And I was like, I'm gonna fucking write some rock music. Like we're gonna be in a band. You're gonna do what I say. Like, like they were like, I mean, we were joking. They were very much joking. They're like, yeah, if you want to like whip us or something, like you could do that. I was like, it was very like it was part of the piece, and they were very good. They were very good natured about it, and um, it kind of became like a healing processing for me. So yeah, it'll be the first. We're doing it at the Bang on a Can Long Play Festival next week. So I'll see how I feel after everything, and I guess it would have to be the right kind of group and the right, like, make a situation that feels good for me.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to hearing the piece after all that.
Pushing a boulder up a hill.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for doing this, Amirtha. This was awesome.
Yeah, totally glad. I'm glad we could find the time.